Oh man, let's take a trip down memory lane, folks. In one of my previous videos, I talked about the BRATS documentary that was out on Hulu, done by Andrew McCarthy, as he tried to talk to every member of the Brat Pack. If you haven't seen that, please go check that out. I'll put the link in the description. But I just wanted to ask myself, what were my favorite movies when I grew up in the 80s? Now, the 80s were a time period I had my teenage years, and it was great. I loved growing up during that time period. So I just wanted to go through and look at all the movies that were listed in the 1980s. And wow, let me tell you something here. Oh man, there was so many, and it's like I composed a list as to all the movies that I saw back then when I was a kid. I also composed a list as the movies that I did not see back then during the 80s, but I saw later on in my adult life. And so let's just have some fun with this. Now, I wanted to break this down into three time periods. My first time period is from 1980 to 1983, and that was before I was in high school. Now, I started high school in the fall of 1983, but I'm going to definitely put 1983 as before high school because there was a lot of movies that came out in 1983 before I started my freshman year. And what I wanted to do was talk about the movies that I loved, that I went to go see and loved in my high school time period, and which was from 1983 to 1987. So that category is going to be from 1984 to 1987. And again, 1987, I graduated in June of 1987. And so the calendar year still went on, but I still wanted to classify 1987 as my high school years because I basically wanted to put these into three categories. And so I wanted to, that's why I included 1987, even though there was a lot of movies that came out after I graduated. So that's was my other criteria for that. And then my other category is the late 1980s after I graduated from high school, which is 1988 and 1989. And there was still a lot of movies that came out. And so what I wanted to do was to compose what were my favorite movies in each time period. And I rounded it out to the top 5 movies of each category. And then what I'm going to do is tell you, based on my that time period that I lived, what were my favorite movies of all time in the 1980s. So as I get done with this list in these categories, then I'm going to talk about what were my all-time favorites of the decade. And this was back when I was at living at the time. And the question is, are there going to be some movies right now in this present day? Do I still agree with the top 5 list? So let's get into it. So let's start out with the movies that came out before I went to high school. And there was quite a few, and there was a lot that I really liked. And so, what were my favorites at that time period? That's the key. So, what were my favorites back then? So, the first one, it's Empire Strikes Back. I mean, to me, it's my favorite Star Wars movie of all time, and it's up there as one of my top movies from the 1980s. My next favorite movie from that time period was The Man from Snowy River. I really loved the filming of that movie. It was filmed in Australia. That's such a beautiful country. If I had an opportunity to visit Australia, I would do so because that was just such an excellent movie, and the cinematography at that time period was just great. My next favorite movie was Raiders of the Lost Ark, the very first Indiana Jones movie. And it was not called Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark at that time. It was simply called Raiders of the Lost Ark. My next favorite movie was Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan. I thought the first Star Trek movie was really boring. When this movie came out, it was so good. I absolutely loved it. And then my fifth selection for that time period is Return of the Jedi. And again, it was what I really liked about it was they included good special effects into it. They just got better and better. Now, to me, it wasn't as great as The Empire Strikes Back, but it still was an excellent finish to the original trilogy. Now we enter into my high school years from 1984 to 1987. And one of the first movies that I really loved at that time period was The Natural. It's the story of a guy who went into the major leagues at a late age. The skipper says, "We don't need no middle-aged rookie." But he defied all odds to get into the major leagues. And it was a great story. It was one of those movies that was just, I enjoyed it. In fact, at the time, that was one of my personal favorites. That was one of those movies that if you're flipping through your TV stations and the movie would come on, I would stop and watch it. That was basically it. My next favorite movie during my high school years was The Karate Kid. And of course, how can you not like it? Because when you think of what that franchise has done and what has happened with the creation of Cobra Kai and how they respectfully talked about the characters from the past and how they did that, The Karate Kid was just, I could relate to Daniel at the time because I was bullied. Now, I never learned to defend myself. I never really got in any school fights. I just ignored the people. And, I would see some of the bullies that I knew back then in recent years. And the guys would say, "Dude, I'm sorry." And we'd get along. That's what you do as adults. You might not like each other as teenagers, but you might like each other as adults. Another movie that was an all-time favorite back then was Top Gun. And what a great movie that was. And I really enjoyed it. So I loved going to it. I watched it several times in the theaters. I watched it several times on video. And it's just timeless. My next favorite movie of my high school time was Back to the Future and how wonderful that was. Michael J. Fox was just a star during that time period. He was working with Family Ties and he decides to go and do his own thing in the movies. And Back to the Future was the first one that he had done, and it was so great. And my next movie, now, gosh, this was such a tough call. It really was. I just I was trying to flip a coin between these two movies. I was trying to see what I liked, what I didn't like about the other, and you know what? I just said, screw it. It's a tie between these two movies as into my top 5. So my first choice is The Goonies, and it was just a wonderful movie. It is just such a timeless movie. You just cannot get over yourself when you talk about The Goonies because it's another one of those movies where it's like if I'm flipping through the channels and if I see The Goonies come on, I'm watching it for the rest of the show, where regardless of where I started. And my other favorite was Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And even though that came out shortly after I graduated from high school, it was so funny. It's like, I wish that movie would have come out like a year before because that would have given me some ideas on how to skip school and how to take a day off and get away with it. I mean, come on. What guy did not want to come up with ways to skip school? Ferris Bueller thought of it all. And so yeah, even though there's 6 of them in this category, I just could not bring myself to leave off one of these. And there was a lot of other movies I could not leave off, but it's like, okay, if I did this, I had to do that. I'm like, oh, this was the toughest category because this time period of the movies were just awesome. And now my final category, my post-high school graduation time period, 1988 and 1989. My first choice was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And one of my best friends and I would go see that. We'd see it like several times. We'd always go,
be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes!
All the clips that they would show from there.
We gotta go. It's a history report, not a babe report. Those are historical babes.
It was so stupid, but it was hilarious. And guys going back in time, getting all these historical figures for a final exam. It was just so crazy. I actually enjoyed it. Another favorite movie of mine back then was Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. And it talked about two guys who were con artists and they were trying to see who can out-con each other because of this one lady. And the funny thing about that was that she was the con artist herself. And so she played them. It was so hilarious. You had Michael Caine, you had Steve Martin, just two guys that were just had different styles of con artists. And what was cool about this is that Michael Caine's character, his butler, was played by Ian McDiarmid, the Emperor in Star Wars. Another favorite movie of mine was Turner and Hooch. Tom Hanks was great in this movie. It was hilarious. He was such a perfectionist. He wanted to make sure everything was done right. He comes upon this dog who was an eyewitness to a murder, and the dog just totally messed his life up. It was so hilarious, and it was just great. And for Tom Hanks's character to come around to finally having a good bond with the dog, with Hooch, it was great. My next favorite movie at that time period was
I'm Batman.
1989. That was just so great. What I loved about Batman was not only the character played by Michael Keaton, but the character, the Joker, played by Jack Nicholson.
Wait till they get a load of me.
I'm glad you did.
Shoot them all! We're gonna take him out a whole new door!
He really stole that movie. His character was so profound. It was great. He really elevated the quality of that movie. And so kudos to you, Jack Nicholson. For me, Michael Keaton is the Batman GOAT. Enough said. And the best Joker of all the franchises was Jack Nicholson's Joker. So this was really one of those movies that I just really loved at the time. And my final choice for this category was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Don't call me Junior.
And what a great finish. To me, this was where the Indiana Jones saga ends. The other two Indiana Jones movies that came out, toss those. They don't count. I don't care. The Last Crusade was the final Indiana Jones movie. Bottom line. So for me, I really enjoyed these 5 movies in the late 80s.
Are you ready for my all-time favorite?
Those were my favorite movies of each time period in the 80s. I listed 5 movies of each time period, of each category. Well, you can say 6 during my high school period, but you know what? It's my list. I could do whatever I want. I don't care. So what are my all-time top 5 favorite movies of the 80s? Now, I'm basing this during my time period when I was young. And do I still feel the same about those movies today? Or are there other movies that may have trumped those top 5 movies? We'll see. Now, I'm not going to put this in any particular order because, well, for those movies, you could have, 1 through 5. The list I could switch positions if I wanted to, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just say these are the top 5. And there's no favorite. Okay? All 5 of these movies that I'm going to talk about are great. So Of all of those categories, these are the best movies of the 1980s, according to me. The first one is The Karate Kid. I really loved it. Like I said earlier, I could relate to Daniel's character, but it also shared a close connection with a student and a teacher. What was great about this movie was that it showed a bond between two guys, different generations, with Daniel and Miyagi. It was great. And it is so great with Daniel's character in Cobra Kai, how he can really talk about a lot of the things that Mr. Miyagi taught him, not only throughout his time as a young man, but his time raising his family. So The Karate Kid is timeless for that. Another movie that was on the top 5 of my list is Batman. And like I said, this was great. I really loved the characters played by Michael Keaton and by Jack Nicholson. These guys were just wonderful. They had a great chemistry. And other than the Superman movies, this Batman really set the stage for all the other superhero movies that we see in the 21st century. When you talk about whether you're a DC fan or a Marvel fan, Batman back in 1989 really set the stage for that. Now, you can make the argument about Christopher Reeve's Superman setting the stage, and that's fine. But Batman really did set the tone for future superhero movies. My next movie in my all time top 5 was Top Gun. Watching Top Gun and the fighting sequences in these airplanes, some of them were perhaps unrealistic. If you talk to an actual person who's been in the Navy, who was a pilot, they would definitely say that some of those moves that were in that movie were unrealistic. Some were good, but again, this was just for action sequences, and it was wonderful. And so it was one of those movies that stood the test of time. My next movie is The Empire Strikes Back, and like I said in my category of the movies during my pre-high school existence, that was the best Star Wars movie ever, and it is definitely, for me, the top 5 of all time in the 80s. In fact, it could be even the best movie of all time, according to some people. Some people love The Empire, and it was one of those where it was a rare occurrence where the sequel was better than the original. And it was so great seeing the struggles that the rebellion had to go through, the training that Luke did with becoming a Jedi, with him facing Darth Vader, and the surprise reveal. Ooh, wow.
I am your father.
That was just a great movie. And rounding out the top 5 for me is The Natural. And it was just one of those movies that I could see it over and over again, several times, and never get tired of it. Because the life of Roy Hobbs, for him wanting to join the major leagues, being altered by a shocking event, and for him trying to get back into the majors in his mid 30s, people were saying that's impossible. Now, again, this was just fictional, but the story was just incredible. And the ending of it was just phenomenal. In fact, it's one of my all time favorite baseball movies ever. So, The Natural is just one of those that I really enjoyed. So, those were my picks for the top 5 during that time period. Now, how do I feel about those movies? Are there any movies that make the case for top 5 of all time? Oh, boy. I don't know. I was I don't know. I was just looking at this list and I just could not bring myself to replace any of these movies. They just, they, for me, they stand the test of time. It's just one of those things where I can never get tired of watching those. I just cannot bring myself to replace any of these top 5 movies. So basically, these movies are here to remain for me. So those were my all-time favorites. What were your favorite movies of these categories that I put down? Are there any other 80s movies that you liked? Please let me know in the comments. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe to my channel and to turn on the notifications. Wherever you may be, this is Blazerhawk Darren reminding you that no matter how high you may soar, always stay grounded.